an original MCM production.
I want to welcome everybody to Turner Hall, the Turner Hall Ballroom. This is a building that has been around in various shapes and conditions for, what now, 160 years, 80, 70 years, something like that. It's housed many people, many of them ornery, all of them very smart, and dedicated to one thing, the civic life and making Milwaukee better. So that's what we're gathered here tonight to do and to talk about, which is Jane's Walks. Jane Jacobs, as many of you probably know, was also ornery and really smart, but it's a good thing because she stopped one of the most amazing bridge and highway builders and freeway builders that the country had ever seen, Robert Moses. There's a great book out called Wrestling with Moses. And it's about Jane Jacobs and how it took her 10 years to stop him completely from building freeways through Soho and Washington Park, which, if you can think of it today, would have been a complete disaster. And our former mayor, John Norquist, stopped a similar freeway from going through Milwaukee's East Side, which again is some of Milwaukee's best real estate and absolutely put together and brought together neighborhoods. So we have been working for many years on physically reuniting neighborhoods. And what Jane's Walks are about is reigniting the organic fabric of neighborhoods. So it's reigniting and reuniting people coming together and rebuilding communities and getting people to come together who have the overlapping self-interests of this is their home, this is their neighborhood, what can we do to make it better? So we have some wonderful people talking about that tonight with different tools. I want to announce something very exciting. We have a brand new walk that has just been put up by Virginia Small. Virginia, stand up. You there? It's the Olmsted Walk in Central and over at East at the parks. So you can find it online, I'm pretty sure. So now we're up to 7. We're a great city because we've gone from 1 walk to 7 walks in 1 year, which means we skipped a whole label of much lesser cities than us because now we are a dialogue city. Okay. So one of the things that I would like to talk about that is really special is that we have been doing walks in Milwaukee for a long time. And they've been done on ground level, and our alderman has been doing it. And I happened to go on a very special walk on Monday with Alderman Mullally Coggs. And I want to introduce some of the people from her office and her neighborhood who cause these and do these, who were just wonderful. Would you like to stand up? Is Kawana? Please stand up. Drexler? And Cheryl Hampton. Cheryl, stand up. I have to tell you, Cheryl is one of these people who makes trouble. And may we all make the kind of trouble that she makes, because she had trailing behind her building inspectors, policemen, social workers, everything, because what they do is that they walk through a neighborhood and say, this is what's been going on in this house, this is what's going on in this house, and this is how neighborhoods change, is when people take charge of their neighborhoods. So what Jane's Walks are about is everybody taking charge of their neighborhoods and developing an eye and a language for how to do it and how to assess it. And the person, one of the people who is doing a wonderful, is working with developing a language and helping us train our eye is Chris SOCHA. And I would, from the Urban Lab, TKWA, Urban Lab, Chris, talking about pattern language.
Well, thank you so much for coming out this evening. We had a great time last year when Mayor Norquist showed up, and we got to listen to 2 hours of just wonderful storytelling that had us all kind of on the seats, edge of our seats. And the hope this year is to kind of continue what he started. And what's really neat is we had one Jane's Walk, I think, last year that I led in the pouring rain, if you remember that day, if you were here. We canceled it about an hour before it started, and I thought, boy, I better go to the starting place just to make sure nobody missed the message. And, you know, to my surprise, 30 people were there, and I said, okay, you've been outside, right? And I said, yeah. I'm like, well, do you want to still do this walk? And they all said, well, heck yeah, we do. So we spent an hour wandering West Town, and to me, I knew we were onto something there because people cared. They cared enough to walk in the rain, and it was an invigorating moment, and so it's really fun to be back this year and have the chance to actually speak. So tonight, I'm going to give a talk, and I have a lot to cover, so I'm going to move quickly here, but what it's called is Building Vibrancy, and let's see if my clicker works just to start. Of course it does not. Oh, I have to turn it on. That helps. We're in. Okay, so vibrancy is a term that I'm going to kind of go to again and again here. And what I hope you walk away with this evening is hopefully with a different way of seeing, a different way of evaluating the built environment around you, an understanding of a process that can help you identify problems that you're trying to solve, and then also build consensus towards solutions to these problems. And so we start with what I call vibrant settings. A lot of you probably recognize this neighborhood, and if you don't, it's Brady Street. This was my home for over a decade, and it's a place that I love dearly to this day, and it was a place that I very intentionally selected to live. What I loved is that I could walk out my front door and be steps away from restaurants, from bars, a bike ride or a walk to the lakefront, a bike ride or a walk to the river, easy access to downtown, all these wonderful things. I loved the cross-section of people that were found there, multicultural, multi-generational. It was a true mix, and is a true mixed-use neighborhood where your whole life can be within a few blocks. It's changing now, but change is constant in cities, and the question is sort of how do you keep it a place that's resilient? And so I start there because it was on Brady Street where I reconnected with Jane Jacobs and her seminal book, The Life and Death of Great American Cities. And I realized as I read that on my porch and in my house, I was looking at Brady Street in many ways how Jane Jacobs was looking at the West Village in the 1950s and watching sort of the ballet of street life that happened in front of her very house, and how it was changing, and how she realized that was something that needed to be protected. And so I have to tell just a little bit of personal backstory to get to the meat of this story. So I work for a company called Kubala, Washatko Architects. I've been there for over 19 years. This is our main office in Cedarburg. It's a wonderful place to work. It's a repurposed old power station that's on the river in downtown Cedarburg, if you're familiar with it at all. And you know, here it is on the inside. I wish this photo was full of people because it doesn't represent the kind of humming hive of activity that it is on a day-to-day basis. And as an architect, I have to say, I really despise architectural photos that don't have people in them, because what we pride ourselves on is a people-first architecture, and that's what this whole talk is about. So just a quick synopsis of work that you might recognize: the Iron Horse Hotel. This is a proposal for a new DNR trailhead at Lakeshore State Park. We work regionally. This is a in addition to a Frank Lloyd Wright church in Madison, the Unitarian Church, if you're familiar with that. Very contentious project. At the outset, very few people in the congregation wanted an addition to happen at all. By the time we went through the pattern language process, we had about 95% consensus, not only that the project was worthwhile, but exactly how we would do it. This is the Charmant Hotel. It's in La Crosse as an adaptive reuse of an old candy factory there. We're working nationally. This is a proposed nature center in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we're working internationally now. This is a 3,000 student elementary school in the heart of Beijing, China. Don't even ask me how we got this project. It was a long story. The short of it is, never underestimate who you're talking to and how things might come around eventually in life. So for me personally, I've kind of been fortunate to have good timing and blessed with really great clients. And I show a couple personal projects here as a lead-in to the rest. When I came out of school, the public market was in a competition phase, and as the young guy in the firm, it was easy to put me on the project and help kind of craft the design. We spent about 1.5 years working on the commission. We won it in a competition. I went back to school for a couple years to get my master's. Came back and they had just finished their fundraising and got to actually see it through design and completion. And to me, the public market is one of these examples of vibrancy in the city that we can kind of very proudly point to. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened by some very good decision making that preceded it in the 3rd Ward. And so what you're looking at in this image here, well, does anybody recognize this street? It looks different today. That's Broadway. That's Broadway in the 3rd Ward. You're looking south. You'll recognize Myad on the right, the Marine Terminal building on the left. The street looks wide and angry and probably had cars speeding through it pretty quickly because it was a thoroughfare. And you'll notice what's conspicuously absent is Catalano Square. And so what happened was the city saw an opportunity to create an asset at the southern end of Broadway in the 3rd Ward. And that became something that effectively slowed down the street, created a public realm at the end of it. They reconfigured parking. The public market became the northern terminus to what we can arguably say is one of Milwaukee's finest streets right now. It actually supports some of the highest retail rents in not only the city, but the region right now. So here it is on just an average sunny day. In the summer, it's full of people all the time. They have like 15% growth annually on sales there. It's incredible. So it's a place to meet. It's a place where the city comes together both. What's really curious is I think they get about 90% of their business from a 1-mile radius around it, but they also get a huge draw from tourists and regional draw. So it's both a local and kind of regional connector. And when you start to create that kind of hub of energy, really fun stuff just starts to happen. Like this year they put an ice bar around a tiki bar, which became this ephemeral thing that happened that people got excited about. And this stuff happens because there's actually people there to support it. So I'm also fortunate enough to do the work for Colectivo Coffee for about the last decade, and it started with Humboldt Roastery, then moved on to what was their original roastery on Prospect, and we reimagined how we could put a soul back in this place. We then went to Bayview and introduced a baking facility down there and actually catalyzed really the development of an entire urban space. This was a wildly complicated project that actually pushed out 27 feet into the public realm on Lincoln and really contributed, I think, what is now a major gateway feature in terms of how you move through Bayview. And so if I had to pick one of them that I think embodies this notion of vibrancy and certainly who Colectivo is as a company is the 3rd Ward location. I love it because it's the size of a postage stamp. I also love it because it has a relationship with the public market. If you've been down there, it's more like a kiosk than it is actually a cafe. And so everything about it has to be poetic. Everything has to work. Everything has to do more than just one thing. So a bike rack in this case becomes a drink rail. On the inside, it's all about how you see the public market, how you interact with it. So this whole thing opens up and it has this fuzziness to it. You don't know if you're indoors. You don't know if you're outdoors. And so, this is one of my favorite photos because my wife and daughter are in it. But more importantly, what it shows is the public market in the background And what it talks about is this notion of what the public realm is, and that's really what this talk is all about. And so the public realm, when we use that term, we're talking about streets, we're talking about sidewalks, we're talking about plazas, parks. It's all the shared space that we use. And that shared space is the majority of what actually makes up a city. And this is where Milwaukee is lagging behind in terms of how we rate to peer cities, and we're going to talk about that. So we're at a really critical juncture, I would argue, right now, and there's a couple things that are happening. Number one, there's a collective awakening of sorts that cities matter. And so there's a demographic shift that's happened where simultaneously your two largest blocks, baby boomers and millennials, are both saying at the same time, cities have value and we want to be there. And so what that's doing right now is driving a massive surge in private investment in our downtown. It's not happening just in Milwaukee, it's happening all over the country, it's happening internationally. And I think what it recognizes is that, you know, when the flight to the suburbs started to happen, you can kind of forget sometimes that it's an experiment of sorts. And everything we've done as a civilization that predated that suggested that we like being close to one another and we like being in cities, and that's where commerce happened, that's where social life happened. And so we're kind of coming back to that, and we're realizing in some ways that maybe it's time to fix our greatest assets. And so running alongside that is this notion that place matters. And so there's book after book after book that's coming out right now with people talking about this subject. These are the books that I devour, and it's curious how quickly they're being published, and they all have kind of a similar narrative. And what's interesting about it all is there's clear solutions to sort of how we mend what was scarred over a period of decades. And so for me, you know, doing this over 19 years and really kind of putting my passion into the space between buildings rather than the buildings themselves so much is this understanding that it's this urban realm that really drives the vitality of a place. And I love this photo. It's in a European city. I'll be perfectly honest. I'm not even sure which city it's in. I don't care. I just get lost in it because when I talk about the public realm, that's what you see here. The buildings contain a space. They make an outdoor room. You can see that this is a place that invites walking. It invites biking. I suspect it invites automobiles as well in front of it. That's a place you want to spend time. You can tell it's clearly a cold day there, and it is packed beyond belief. And so what's kind of occurred to me is you simply can't have a great city without a great public realm, period. And this really struck me a couple years ago when I was working with Fred Kent from Project for Public Spaces, and we were working on this project on 4th of Wisconsin together, which you'll see in a moment. And we had spent a day wandering the city on a tour of sorts, sort of saying, you know, look at all the wonderful developments going on downtown. And you could see people very excited to share all the great things that are happening. And there is great things happening, like pound for pound, we are holding our own compared to peer cities when it comes to private development. And so at the end of this very fun, kind of boastful tour, Fred was asked rather pointedly, well, what do you think? What do you think? And he said, well, your streets suck. And you could kind of feel the air coming out of the room. And it dawned on me, oh my goodness, he's right. And so, and when we say the streets are not working, it's not that there are potholes in them. It's literally how they work, how the kind of equity of movement that they accommodate. So what this really facilitated was the birth of our new studio, which I lead, which is called TKWA Urban Lab. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we're in Cedarburg as our primary office. I've been talking to the founding partners, Tom Kubala and Alan Washatko, for years and saying, boy, when you're in Cedarburg, you might as well be in Green Bay. And so we need to be in the city. And if we're going to be leading the way about talking about how you bring a vibrant public realm to the city, we have to be in the heart of it. So we're in Walker's Point now in this very cool new office. And really, we're committed to helping a city and viewing it as a living organism. And we have a process that's really invested in this notion of vibrancy, and I want to kind of share that with you right now. So This goes back to October of 2014 when we gave a presentation at the Creative Alliance, the Creative Summit. And so this is a collection of about 300 to 400 regional creatives, a really wonderful event. And we got to give the full presentation, of which you'll see a bit of it here. And it really hit home with a lot of people. And so these are just shots of the day. These are maps we were working on that were focused on West Town. So after we gave this talk, we workshopped over it where people can kind of look at the city in a different way. And so here's the site we were studying. This is 4th and Wisconsin. So if you can put yourself there, it's only blocks down the street. It's a surface parking lot right now. The convention center is across the street. The Hilton's right there. This is an image of what predated the urban renewal. And so it's probably hard to read from your vantage point, but it was clearly the Whig district at one point. But beyond that, what it was hotels, it was offices, it was retail, it was multi-use, it was declared blight at the time, and I suspect if it were still there, it would be closer to what Milwaukee Street looks like downtown today than what this site currently looks like right now, which is this. And so it's remained this way since about 1984, and the city generously offered to creatives in the community to help solve this thing. And so we were invited to that process, and I remember being in a room with a number of creatives, and if you're ever in an environment like that, you know that decision making can be a little unwieldy, and everybody has an opinion. And we asked the question, well, what is it we're actually solving for here? And the answer that kind of dawned on us was we're solving for a vibrant piece of land. But then it very quickly spiraled from that. And we said, well, something's inhibited development from happening here, beyond politics, beyond other things. What is inhibiting development in West Town? And you have to remember that in 2014, the incredible development that's happening around us right now was just in kind of its emergent stages. We didn't really know this was coming, and I'm still surprised, to be honest, of it, and I'm thrilled. So when I say vibrancy, I think it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I always like to use the joke with the famous judge that said about pornography, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. And with vibrancy, what I like to say is, you know it when you feel it. It's sort of a gut thing. You know when you're in a place that's just working, that's singing, where everything is in harmony. And so what we propose here really is that the built environment, it contributes to how you feel somewhere. And so these are two images side by side. To the right is essentially the site today. To the left is the first iteration of Milwaukee's night market, which was the same year, 2014. And when Milwaukee suggested they were going to do this thing 4 times a year in the heart of downtown on Wisconsin Avenue, a lot of people said, I don't know that anybody's going to show up. How are they going to get there? Where are they going to park? They're going to be scared. That first night, 10,000 people showed up. And what was so invigorating to me was who showed up. It was as wide a cross-section of people as you've ever seen at any street festival in Milwaukee on any given weekend in the summer. It wasn't the familiar crowd. It was a different crowd, and something felt unbelievably invigorating about it. And so I felt like in a lot of ways, there's still some cultural capital on Wisconsin Avenue. We haven't lost kind of the embodied history of what it used to be, and there's that residue there, and we're finding ways to bring it back now. So all of this work, this idea that space can be alive, it's indebted to a fellow named Christopher Alexander. He's an architect, he's a theorist, a mathematician, a number of things, an amazing individual, and he wrote a book called A Pattern Language back in the early 70s. And it's one of the most well-read architectural publications ever written. He went on to write something called The Nature of Order, which is a much deeper dive, unbelievable book, which we've been reading for years. And so the vibrancy we're talking about, it sort of comes through this pattern language, this pattern writing process, and I want to just kind of walk you through what that means exactly. So first of all, what the heck is a pattern? Well, the simplest way I know to explain it is that it is a physical or a human activity that happens over and over, and a physical space that's really best suited to support that activity. So it's kind of a mouthful, but just think about it. Some things just work really well in certain settings, and there's reasons for it. So to understand what a pattern is, it's kind of helpful to understand what they are not. In my world of architecture, a lot of architects get caught up in style. This is not a style-driven process where a napkin sketch becomes a building miraculously and it's sort of imposed by somebody's vision. It's not mechanistic, meaning there's this sort of kit of parts you put together and wrap a skin around and call it a building. So when you put these processes side by side, the pattern process is one that's holistic. It forces you to consider everything. It forces you to listen carefully, and it forces you to understand that everything is sort of connected. The other side tends to be reductionist in that it's often hard to share style in the world of design. You're often deaf to real needs when you've already presumed you have the solution. And so it's a very different way of looking at how you shape the environment. So what these really do is they force you to find problems. They force you to ask the question, what are you trying to solve and how do you do it? So really the best way to understand it is just to see one in practice. We did the Madison Children's Museum, which is basically right on the square in Madison. And there are a few key parts that I have to explain in terms of what a pattern looks like. So there's always a title, and there's a problem statement, and then there's a solution statement. So in this case, we titled this Speed Bump. And the idea is that the title is sort of poetic. It's evocative. Coupled with an image, you kind of know what's going on here. And what we said is, okay, listen, here's a problem that you have when a child is going to the front door of a children's museum. They are amped up, they're ready to get in that space, they want to take off like a speeding bullet, and meanwhile mom and dad are trying to get ticketed and put coats away. What do you do about it? So what the solution statement describes is a framework of criteria that need to be met for success. It's not a prescriptive thing, but what it suggests is certain things have to happen in the physical environment for this thing to unfold right. And so the end result here was this like fanciful art installation, or this interactive installation that met you upon entry. It could capture a child's imagination. Caregivers can take care of business, and off you go. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So we're going to go down the rabbit hole from the roof of the Children's Museum to 4th and Wisconsin now. So in this image, north is up, the convention center is the top of the screen, the Hilton's on the left, the Boston store is on the right. So very quickly, we realized as we looked at this site, we're not really just solving for 4th and Wisconsin, we're solving for Westtown. And in effect, we're solving for kind of the interconnectivity of the city to get this right. And it was a daunting moment because, we were doing this kind of out of the goodness of our heart on this project, and we realized we were about to embark on a pretty long endeavor. And I'm really thankful that we did. But when you have a project of this size, a neighborhood, your pattern language could be 50 plus in length. And I should explain that patterns are hierarchical in nature, meaning that you work from the largest scale issue iteratively down to the next smaller one, to the next, to the next. And you don't really stop until you actually solve the problems. And so for the sake of this, I'm going to illustrate the top 4 that we identified here. And it's clear to understand, what's key to understanding this is when we talk about a vibrant city, we're looking at it through the lens of the greatest cities in the world, the most livable cities in the world, are ones that prioritize people first. And so there is a hierarchy of priority that a lot of people are talking about these days, and I really love this, where it says, listen, your streets, your public realm should serve pedestrians first, then bikes, then transit, then commercial vehicles, then high occupancy vehicles, and then single occupancy vehicles. And what it's meant to do is not say the car is evil, the car is terrible, we should get rid of it. It's meant to say this stuff all has to coexist and we have to balance it somehow. And so I just found this illustration like 2 days ago. It's by a Swedish artist, and he was commissioned by the Swedish DOT to do an illustration of how we've treated people in cities as of late. I think it's pretty telling, so you can see the sidewalks are very narrow, the crosswalks are wobbly little gangplanks, and the street is cavernous and large. And I thought, wow, this sums it up. This sums up how you feel in certain places. So the number one issue we recognize as needing resolution in Westtown was what we called pedestrian continuity. And it was this notion that, listen, Milwaukee has pockets of really wonderful, life-filled places, but the issue is they're all spread too far apart to kind of walk to. So you often wind up driving. And what was really curious is a group called Translator, a creative agency in the 3rd Ward, was doing psychographic research paralleling our built realm analysis. And what they found interviewing hundreds of stakeholders in Westtown was that people had very strong feelings. And this quote here was, there's pockets of great, pockets of awful, with too much space between the pockets of great to connect it all. And we were kind of floored how it paralleled the analysis of the built environment. So what we did is we struck a 5-minute walk, or a quarter-mile radius around the site, and then we did what we would call sort of like an intuitive nodal map that showed here's where pedestrian activity is pretty constant. And the larger the circle, the orange circle, the more activity that happens there. And as we looked at it, we said, boy, there's not much within that circle, is there? That's a problem. And so there's science that backs this up. There's a lot of people have been looking at this for years, and what basically that quarter-mile radius, what it equates to is that is understood to be the maximum distance most people are willing to walk before they start grumbling. It's also a 5-minute walk. And what good cities exhibit is, at a base minimum, about every 1,200 feet, things are happening. And that's a base minimum. So just some geography here. So Westtown has very distinct borders. You have the river on the west, you have 43 on the east, and then you've got McKinley and the river in the south. And so generally people kind of move through Westtown in an east-west fashion right now. And what's curious is this is really the geographic heart of the city. And at its most alive, people are going to come at it from every angle possible. And so if we go back to that site and we strike our 5-minute walk radius around the site, that's the minimum you'd need. That's every 1,200 feet or every quarter mile of just pockets of life happening. Now, that's the minimum. This is what a really good city looks like. This is what Paris feels like. So it's much denser in terms of the packing of things that are happening. So we paralleled that with Bubbler, and the bike share system Bubbler, they follow where people are. And so this map is a little dated at this point, but in blue showed where stations were or are currently, and gray showed where they want to be. And what we found curious is this map started to look a little closer to that dense packing of activity zones. And so we see Bubbler really being supportive of a walking environment, and the two go hand in hand. Second one is what we called short blocks. We have really long blocks in Westtown. They're 350 feet by about 450 feet long. And what urban design tells us is that blocks, as they grow beyond about 200 by 200 feet, the quality of life diminishes on them. And so we looked at the historic block structure of the city. And if you know your Milwaukee history, you had Juneautown in the east, Kilbourne Town in the west, and Walker's Point in the south. And what's curious about them all is they had a unique block structure, and I'm sure everybody is generally aware of our misalignment of the bridges because they didn't like each other terribly. So in Westtown, what we did is we said, well, let's take a look at this. This is a figure ground on the left. Buildings black, streets are white. We compared that to Portland, Oregon, which has a 200 by 200 grid, and I think most of us know the city is thriving right now, and it's in part because of just the structure of the city itself. You see notable differences between these two maps, right? These are scaled exactly the same. So there's that same figure ground map. Now watch what comes up below this. That is Milwaukee circa 1900. And just, it's curious to note some things here. So you look at the convention center, notice that we've lost 5th Street entirely. At the Grand Avenue, we lost 3rd Street. You also see, as this kind of fully emerges, a really clear alley network. So 350 feet became 175. 450 became, I don't want to do math right now, but that was a very different place. And when you look at kind of what's left of Westtown, it's no mistake that 3rd Street was the first to revitalize here and continues to thrive because it has a structure, a fine-grained structure. It was predisposed to adaptive reuse. And it sits amongst a very different condition. So what the solution suggests here isn't tearing down Westtown, but it's looking for opportunities to address this issue when we have the chance to. And so we compared this to Melbourne, Australia, which in 1980 was not dissimilar from Milwaukee in that by 5 o'clock the city center emptied out. There were, I believe, 2,000 people living downtown. And what they did is they reclaimed a series of laneways. And in the late 1800s, what had happened was merchants like incise these alleys, these laneways, to service their businesses that were there. And what Melbourne saw was an opportunity to capture these spaces as very intimate people places, micro-entrepreneurial in nature. I mean, you look at the fabric of this. Everything is 15, 20 feet wide. You know, there's business next to business. There's all these different ways to move through the city as a result. And now Melbourne consistently ranks as one of the most livable cities in the world. And you know, think about that for a moment. In 1980, it was a city nobody wanted to be in. In 2017, and even before that, one of the most livable. So what it suggests is that change can happen quickly if you're paying attention. Supporting streets. I love this one because what it talks about is the nature of like anything that's alive. It doesn't happen in isolation. There are other things that support it. And we often hear people lamenting the demise of Wisconsin Avenue, fail to actually talk about all the other streets that fed into a vibrant Wisconsin Avenue. And so this map right here, for me, is probably the most telling map in the whole presentation. So everything that is in blue is either surface parking, structured parking, or low-use infrastructure, i.e. Arena or convention center where either everything is on or everything is off, and things are generally in the off condition. And so you look at that for a moment and ask yourself, how on earth can vitality and vibrancy emerge from that environment? And yet people, they'll tell you there's nowhere to park downtown. It's like, what? Really? So to fix this, we have to start working on all the streets that feed into Wisconsin Avenue. And so here it is today. We're south of the site. I generously call this a hellscape. I mean, it's a car sewer. It's essentially a street that we've said it does not matter. So what the supporting streets patterns suggest as a solution is care for that feeds into it. And you don't have to look far back in history. This is 3rd Street, about 1950. 3rd Street was the north-south equivalent of Wisconsin Avenue. Now, if Wisconsin Avenue looked like this today, we would all be high-fiving each other and moving on to the next issue that we'd like to solve downtown. This is Plankington. And of course, the Whig District. But you see what we're up against here. So the last one I'm going to walk you through is what we call big meets small. Westtown is unique in that it has aggregated a series of very large footprint buildings. You know them all. There's the Panther Arena, the Bradley Center, the Convention Center, and what do they all have in common? They take up many blocks, they're generally blank to the street, and they're either on or they're off. So I love this slide because what it does is it speaks to how the built environment shapes how we feel. So that psychographic research that Translator was running, they found so many people that said, Westtown's, it's not safe. It's dead at night. I don't want to be there. I feel threatened. Now, people that really know Westtown know that it couldn't be further from the truth. You know, it is a very safe place. Yeah, there are some issues. There's panhandling, but generally harmless. Now, look at this photo for a moment. And first of all, where are the people? Now, you know, to be fair, you could probably find another image where there are some people wandering around. But regardless, if an unsavory character is mid-block down there and you're essentially by yourself, where do you go? The blocks are long. So where is the shop you duck into? Where's the next place you go into? If that person is a threat or not, doesn't matter. You feel threatened because of the conditions that we have built. So what Big Meets Small suggests is that, listen, these are all key parts of our community. We need a convention center. We need a bigger convention center. We need the arenas. But we need to design them in a way that doesn't kill street life 24/7. And there are strategies for that. In Detroit, they're building their hockey arena that's essentially lined with 24/7 activity, offices, housing, restaurants, et cetera. You don't even know the arena's there until you happen upon the front door. In Portland, Oregon, what they use are food carts. They're there 365 days a year, open every day. There are over 400 of these in Portland right now. And what they do, what you see in this photo, is they mask surface parking. You know, there's no bigger scourge in a walking environment than going from a wonderful, you know, tree-lined, building-lined street to all of a sudden the void of a surface parking lot. You can literally feel your humanity kind of sinking. And that's the kind of environment that is out here now. It's driving their food tourism, it's driving their food beverage ecosystem there. It's an incredible thing. It's the kind of thing we can do here. Sometimes you can't line a building, sometimes you can't put food carts or whatever in front of it. There are parklets. We're actually doing that pretty well in Milwaukee. So the patterns, what they promise to do is allow you to see, I think, you know, the world in a clear way. They allow you to educate people. It's terribly difficult doing design. People have opinions about everything, and what the pattern writing process allows you to do is, one by one, look at an issue, agree together that this is what you need to solve, and then move on to the next thing. So it's a consensus building tool. Like I said, that Unitarian church we did in Madison, I think the number was 5% of the people thought the project should happen at all. And 95% agreed by the end of it. And so, and that's just one case study. We've used this over and over. And so I want to leave you just with a video here that we did. So all of this work, what it led to was actually getting the commission to redesign the Grand Avenue Mall. I couldn't have forecast that was coming, but you know, by a lot of work and some luck, getting the owner's attention, said, hey, I think we know how to solve this thing. And so I've spent the last year working with a really wonderful ownership group that desperately wants to do the right thing in the city. And we're trying to think of the city in a bigger way. How do we not just heal the mall, but how do we heal Westtown? And so the map you're seeing right now shows the MSO and their proposed addition that would happen at the Grand Theater. And I met Mark Niehaus one day, the executive director, and said, Mark, this is great. You have to push this wall at the MSO 35 feet east into 2nd Street. That is going to give us the opportunity to narrow 2nd Street and make it this wonderful walking, biking environment. What if we start thinking about your project in concert with the Grand Avenue and think about how 2nd Street could be this vital connection, not just from MSO to the Grand Ave, but from Père Marquette to a revitalized Postman Square, to the MSO, to Grand Avenue, to Michigan Street. Wells Street's about to be resurfaced. I really hope we're going to stripe it the right way. 2nd Street has money in a TID right now that will be driven by the MSO project. And so what this does is it doesn't necessarily design the environment, but it shows the opportunities that should not be missed. If we are really going to make a city that's livable, walkable, bikeable, supports transit, this is the kind of thing we have to be thinking about, because you'll see what flash up in a moment here. That's the Germania building in the back. That's Postman Square, which is a little postage stamp right now. It's a C in a traffic island. What we're proposing is, why not we make this a very generous public realm that actually connects over to the buildings across the street to the west that are currently vacant on their retail storefronts, create a really dignified public plaza that maybe has a transit-only lane moving through it, really make Postman Square a place that can drive investment around it. The Germania building has investment going in it as we speak, but there are lots of pieces around that could use some help. And so what I found time and time again is when you invest in the infrastructure of what we share, the private investment follows it. So I'm just going to let this thing kind of play out, because that's the end of the talk. So I really appreciate your time and having the chance to speak to you guys tonight.
Hello, everybody. We're going to save questions until the end. We now have two wonderful speakers. Julia Taylor, the Executive Director of the Greater Milwaukee Committee, and Lynne McCormack, who is the Regional Director of Creative Placemaking for LISC. And they're going to talk about that wonderful right-brained part, which really means left-handed, part of what we can do to our own neighborhoods and our own communities.
Good evening, everybody. So it's great to be here with you. commemoration of Jane Jacobs and the difference she's made in the urban life that we all enjoy. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why the Greater Milwaukee Committee is engaged in creative placemaking, why, similar to what Chris talked about, this vibrancy of place is so critical to our city. One reason the GMC is looking at creative placemaking is if you look at our mission statement. It's really to ensure that Milwaukee is the best place to live, work, play, learn, and to stay. And we do this by really working with other people, working with other groups, and I want to talk a little bit tonight about how we do that work. So these are our core focus areas, and if you'll see the third one up there is vibrancy of place. This has become a very important part of work for us. And as Chris talked about West Wisconsin Avenue, I want to talk to you a little bit too about why this became important for us as we were working with WAMDC in that area. So Ellen Gilligan is our Creative Placemaking Committee co-chair, along with Angela Dominati from Milwaukee, and J. Allen Stokes with Harambe Great Neighborhood Initiative. But if you look at this, you can also see in the foundations, there have been more and more investments in placemaking, in looking at turning vacant lots into public parks, ensuring that neighbors own their neighborhood and that they have a place to feel safe and also a place to gather and a place to have community. So we can talk a lot about what's creative placemaking, and I'm going to give you a couple of different examples. Kresge Foundation, which was early investor in creative placemaking, really defines it as the integration of arts and culture and revitalization work. And you're going to see this reference, I think, throughout all of these different different descriptions. This is Art Place America. And Art Place America is basically a number of different funders across the country that came together around this new field of work called creative placemaking and talking about the difference this could make in particularly disinvested neighborhoods across the country. And if you look at this, this really talks about every place having a creative potential, but how you also bring in the neighborhood voice into the work that's going forward. And I love, with National Endowment for the Arts, there was a very important study that was really done early on, a white paper that was written that really defined creative placemaking. And I think as we continue to talk about what this is, I think in my own mind, the description I've come up with creative placemaking is really that it's art that solves problems. It's art that goes into neighborhoods, that has a big community voice and looks at solutions that are different than ones that you would normally see coming out of a developer. Some national examples, Theaster Gates with Rebuild Foundation in Chicago is probably the most well-known artist within the creative placemaking realm. If you get a chance to ever go to Chicago and visit particularly the Stony Island Arts Bank, it's phenomenal. The work he's done in that particular neighborhood with housing and the reinvention of that neighborhood with the arts is phenomenal. The Listening House. But it's a way that he's been able to bring forward the creation of that whole neighborhood. Another big area that I think people are very well familiar with is the High Line. And if you think about that vision of taking an elevated rail line that had been vacated for so many years and using that as a form of art and movement to really recreate parts of New York that have been phenomenal and are now, it's a huge draw for New York. A lot of people that go there, you'll see the pictures of them on the High Line. So what have we done with creative placemaking in Milwaukee? Talk a little bit about our framework. If you look at this, our framework is really taking arts and culture and with looking at how it combines with economic and community development. How do we accelerate neighborhood development by creating that type of civic gathering place for problem solving, for sharing, for cooking, for doing everything that people like to do when they come together? How do you increase density and safety? How do we encourage businesses to locate there, jobs to grow, tax base to improve? And then how do we do this too? By aligning the resources that are already there in the public and the private realm. And a big part of this is supporting the artists and the makers of that neighborhood. So we spent some time actually looking at our core values of creative placemaking in Milwaukee. And these make a difference in what neighborhoods we go to and how we invest. And so having that authentic local voice is very important. Taking a very asset-based approach. A lot of times what looks like in neighborhoods as real liabilities are assets. And I'll talk a little bit about work that we've done in the River West Harambe community, where people were looking at these old commercial buildings and saying, you know, they're eyesores, they're underused. And by the end of it, we were looking at, one, that there were a lot of creative industries already in those buildings, and two, they are a core asset and an identity, a very authentic identity for that neighborhood. Also, creating this platform for community discussion. What do you want to see in your community? What's missing? When you think about it in its best, what is it like to you, and what would you like to see more of? Cultural leadership networks are important. A lot of times leadership in communities and in neighborhoods are well known in that neighborhood but not outside of it. And how do we link those voices so that there's a broader distributive leadership model in this community? It's also encouraging long-term investment. Sometimes creative placemaking can be very episodic and can have a quick impact, like the night markets, particularly, you know, that one night in that month is a huge night for even the businesses in the area. But how do we encourage long-term investment around that? And then how do we connect people to place? And how do we really both highlight and bring to light the creative entrepreneurs and celebrate them? And it does take a lot of people. It takes a lot of cross-sector alignment for this to happen. So some of our projects, the BEERLINE Trail, I don't know if people here are familiar with it, if you've been out to any of the events that have gone on the BEERLINE Trail. But I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about it. But first I want to start off with our initial work, which was Creational Trails. So back in 2014, we got a grant from Art Place America and started to take a look at two areas of work. And so one was on what was called the Avenue, which is West Wisconsin Avenue or Westtown. And we had a lot of work that we were doing at that time with some key business leaders. The mayor had appointed a task force. Steve Chernoff was leading that. And his whole job was really to figure out what to do with the Grand Avenue Mall, what to do with that street, how to turn things around. So we held a strategic actioning session in early, I think the end of 2013, and had a number of stakeholders. We had about 65 people at it that spent 2 days trying to really interview, talk to people, reimagine what that would be like. One of the big things that came out of it was structurally we created an economic development corp called WAMDC, which had the capability to get site control. Whenever you're going to do this work, site control is important. So I'll just tell you a quick little story on that is we did put a fund together that had about $16 million in it to acquire the Grand Avenue. And I don't know if people remember at that point, the Grand Avenue had gone into receivership. It was going up for auction. And it was literally on an online auction. You'd make a bid, you'd have another person would bid, you'd have 3 minutes to respond to that bid. So initially, when the auction went on, we had $16 million put together. We figured we could spend $13 million on it and have $3 million to have the safety cushion to operate it. And the vision of it was not retail. The vision was educational, arts, mixed use, housing. And some of the investors were together in Godfrey Kahn's closing office, actually, where Steve Chernoff works. One of them was Sheldon Lubar, who I think you probably know, who was also an investor in the project. And because this was a kind of an alien process of this online auction, the auction started off kind of slow, and actually the current owners, Interstate Parking, were some of the early bidders that dropped out. And eventually there were two bidders. There was our WAMDC group and another guy from New York. And we got up to, I think, $16 million in the bid. And actually, Steve was out in the hallway talking to some other investors to try to bring another $1 million to the table, which he did. Meantime, our clock's running, and Shel Lubar is yelling at Steve out in the hallway, "Get in here, your job is to push this button." We had agreed only one person would push that computer button to make the bid. At the end, when it reached 17 million, we said, this guy's going to keep going, and we don't have the reserves to keep it moving, so we dropped out of the auction. The guy who had a lot of Russian money from New York acquired it, held the mall for basically about 18 months, and sold it back to the local ownership group here and made about $6 million in the process. So he definitely knew something that we didn't at that time. But at that time, as we were looking at what was going on in the area, we also knew that we had to acquire the property across the street. The Symphony was interested in that hall, and it was a very crazy ownership structure. So WAMDC was successful in acquiring that property, which is one reason why we can look at the Symphony going in there. But the other problem we had as we were looking at that was people were saying, how would we ever get people down here? So through Art Place America, we were able to work with Milwaukee and actually help create Milwaukee's night market. And as Chris was saying, the first one that ran, we had 10,000 people out there. And all of a sudden, the perception of what could happen in that place changed. Because the problem we were trying to solve is we had an area where people said they did not want to go at night. They did not feel safe. And one of the original concepts on it was actually do an overnight kind of camping jamboree. And fortunately, that fell by the wayside, and we decided to go with the night market. And today it's popular. I think there are other communities in Milwaukee that are trying to emulate the night market. So we learned a lot from that, and it really helped change the perceptions. The BEERLINE Trail has been an area that we've been involved with, first with Art Place America to try to reimagine that. This was a mile-long railroad trail that had been vacated that the city was able to acquire during this time and turn into a bike trail. But it's also an area that is really full of creative industries as well as artists. And so this gave us an opportunity to bring two neighborhoods together, Harambee and River West, which are actually very different communities, to celebrate their neighborhood, to map out their assets, and to really reuse and upcycle materials that are to that area to really redefine the area. So we had the Art Place America grant to get it going. The Kresge Foundation continued the investment for 2 years. And we have some important things that have happened as a result of that. Riverworks has continued to grow as a neighbor-based creative district. The housing market is stabilizing in that area, and it had the highest disparity in housing values of any place in the city. And we are seeing a really inclusive platform for both community and discussion start to develop. So some of the things that we wanted to measure to see the impact that creative placemaking was having was the housing. Are people fixing up their houses? Is the market value changing? How is safety actually increasing by the numbers and also by the neighbors' perceptions? We wanted to get more engagement of people. Job creation and income generation are important, and then again, how can we help the bid and the CDC in that area, Riverworks, continue to grow in size and strength so it can make its work grow. So over the last 2 years, we have seen some major impact. We've strengthened Riverworks' efforts to rebuild the economy, and now there's Riverworks Weeks. There's a lot of celebration of the industries, and those 65 industries have grown. We've really increased the visibility of the creative entrepreneurs, and we've built a leadership network that goes between the existing neighborhood leadership and the city leadership. So in our work to continue, our next phase will be to complete the BEERLINE Trail extension, which is to actually look at putting a linear park in there. We are going to be, let me go right here. So we brought in Walter Hood, who is a very well-known public space developer and artist that is going to be coming up with a mile-long linear park on the trail that we think will be It's very much neighborhood informed, but it's going to be, I think, a game changer for that neighborhood as well. We're going to be investing in community structures near that trail. There's no restrooms, there's no public space to use, there's a lack of public space generally in that neighborhood. And we are going to be testing a summer marketplace, which will again increase the opportunity for the entrepreneurs to come together. And we're going to continue to strengthen the cross-sector partnership because we know that that's what will ultimately make a difference in the long-term success. So we believe, again, in the power of public places, and we strive to implement creative placemaking as a solution-based approach to increase vibrancy, the engagement of these neighborhoods, and connect people across economic divides and bring success into neighborhoods in the overall city. So, thank you.
Hi, everyone. How are you tonight? All right, we had to wake up a little bit. It's getting late, and I'm bringing up the rear here. Hi, my name's Lynne McCormack. I'm the National Director of Creative Placemaking for Local Initiative Support Corporation. I joined the organization just about a year and a half ago. Prior to that, I was the Director of Art and Culture in the city of Providence, Rhode Island, which has very many similarities with Milwaukee. I was really impressed with Chris's presentation. We did a lot of that kind of work in our downtown for years and years and years, and the results really paid off, filling in empty spaces, redeveloping urban renewal. So you have a lot of work to do here in that regard, and I thought Chris's presentation was wonderful. I also want to thank Julia. I'm going to skip through a lot of my slides because she already sort of presented the information about creative placemaking and how it got started. But before I do that, I just want to read a quote from Jane Jacobs that I think is really helpful to sort of contextualize things, and it's very short. And I think one of my favorite quotes from her is this one. Cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they are created by everybody. I spent a lot of my career working in our parks department and in our downtown. Providence, Rhode Island is a city that is basically a post-industrial city, much like Milwaukee, only our post-industrialness happened 20 years, 30 years before Milwaukee's. During the Depression, we lost a lot of industry, and then during the 70s, a lot of our industry went south to South Carolina and Georgia. All our textile factories dried up, our jewelry factories closed, and we were left with many brownfield spaces. In the 80s and 90s, the city leadership, the Providence Foundation, which is much like the Milwaukee Committee, started to think about how to reimagine the city. And in that, really focused on our downtown. We opened up a river bridge that was the widest bridge in the world. It had basically been the open sewer for all of the textile and manufacturing industry up the Blackstone Valley River, which is now a national corridor river. But opened that all up, reimagined our downtown, had many shreds. We've worked with Andres Dwani and a project for public spaces as well. So Fred Kent is a friend as well, Chris. And really started to think about what our downtown could be and did a lot of work on that. I worked for 5 mayors in 18 years, and the first mayor was really trying to reinvent the city from a sort of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus kind of circus master. If you see, kind of talk about it, people will start to think that's what it is, while it was more like the emperor with no clothes. But behind the scenes, we had designers and civic leaders really trying to figure out how to rebuild the place. So we had a real big reinvestment in our downtown, but our neighborhoods were still really not being rebuilt or reinvested in. They were disinvested neighborhoods that really had served the mill working population of the mills. It was a lot of mill housing, a lot of 3-deckers. We're the 6th most densely populated city in the country. And so the housing stock was very old and really falling apart, and our city, we had lots of little city parks and things like that. As our work transitioned in the Cultural Affairs Department from a programming office to doing large events and festivals to create that vibrancy that Chris was talking about, to do those night markets and bring people back to places that nobody wanted to go to because they felt unsafe. We did a lot of work around that kind of creative placemaking. And then we had a new mayor come in who was sort of a reformist and decided to elevate arts and culture to a higher level than that and really started working in our neighborhoods and in our communities. That led me, in my own personal kind of work, to really understand the power of investing in our neighborhoods. So in the last 5 years of that job, I really worked hard to do more community development, and we leveraged community development block grant funds. We did tax stabilizations with arts organizations to take over industrial spaces and rebuild them into art centers. And then we started really working with our cultural communities to develop the cultural assets that they were bringing into our neighborhoods. So that's where I come at this work from, and I just wanted to share that with you because I feel like there's a lot of commonalities between Milwaukee and Providence. I spent the day today over in River West, Harambe, with Riverworks and Maggie from the committee. Maggie's backstage. I want to just give a shout out to Maggie and Julia. This has been really great to get to know the work that's been going on here. I'm going to skip a lot of what I was going to talk about because Julia did such a good job contextualizing the creative placemaking work and just kind of dive into how we're working in neighborhoods across the country. Many of you are familiar with LISC, and I want to give a shout out to Dancia Strong-Hill, who's not here tonight, and to Curry Fears in particular, who have been really working closely with the committee to do all this work. So, okay. So just quickly, LISC has invested. LISC is a national organization that is an intermediary. We have 32 offices across the country in urban areas and cities, and then we work in 75 rural communities with community development partners on the ground. We were founded by the Ford Foundation in the late 70s, early 80s to provide compliance and be able to take large funds from the federal government and from banks and then get them into communities that really needed reinvestment and sort of keep those things in compliance, working with smaller CDFIs and community development corporations. So, you know, we've had significant impact across the country and really been, you know, we focus on housing, but then different than some of the other intermediaries that are out there, we also have a building sustainable communities strategy, and that means that we're looking at communities holistically. Our communities and our neighborhoods that we work in, we're really trying to come up with neighborhood plans to improve those places and change the dynamics for the people who live there. As Julie already talked about, we look at our creative placemaking program, which was actually founded just a few years ago with an investment from the Kresge Foundation, as a way to solve problems in disinvested neighborhoods. Basically, for those of you who don't, the creative placemaking terminology has only been around since about 2011. Placemaking as a term has been used for a long time in community development, sort of started using that word in the 60s. There's a lot of controversy around placemaking versus placekeeping. I think the way that we look at it is really about cultivating inherent cultural assets in place. Artworks, this is all sort of background information about the NEA and ArtPlace, so I'll skip through that. But our grant really was part of the Kresge Foundation's efforts to seed creative placemaking across national organizations. So we started with a cohort of PolicyLink, the Trust for Public Land, and Transportation for America as organizations that were brought on board to kind of bring creative placemaking into our networks. Since then, we've received funding, about $1 million from the CDFI Fund and the CERDNA Foundation. Our tools for creative placemaking at LISC are similar to our other tools that we use. We have a grant program, technical assistance, which is actually one of the reasons I'm here today, small business development, or rural programs. But what is it here? Why are we doing this? We're doing this because of a lot of the things Chris talked about earlier and Julia talked about earlier, that creativity and culture inspire, connection and a sense of place. And in our disinvested communities, some of that has been really, for lots of reasons, it's even harder in some of in the neighborhoods that we work in to bring that sense of vibrancy and that sense of agency back to places that really have been disinvested and have had all kinds of structural racism and all kinds of other things happen in those areas, where we're not just trying to reinvent the physical environment, we're also trying to deal with the traumatic effects of poverty and redlining, all kinds of things like that. So we have 3 tenets that we believe in terms of creative placemaking. One is social impacts. How do we help knit back together communities with artists driving an agenda around social cohesion and learning about each other and healing trauma and that kind of thing. This is actually a project in Philadelphia called the People's Paper Co-op that was run by an artist Cindy and Mark Stramberg, who worked with women coming out of prison to expunge their records and create new visions for their futures. And at this point, Faith, who's one of the incarcerated women, is now running the program, and it's really creating a great social network of formerly incarcerated women in that neighborhood to share stories, to create things together, and to kind of start to heal each other as a group. I'm not going to read all these things. I don't need to do that, but I'll just keep talking a little bit. Some of the other projects that we've been doing with the social cohesion theme have been about connecting smaller cultural organizations under one roof to bring the celebrations of their cultures into the neighborhood and become sort of anchor institutions. We've invested in some capacity building work in some of the organizations that are not quite ready to take on debt and are looking to take on buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods and rapidly changing cities like Boston and Washington, D.C. These kinds of social events are sort of, they start with simple things like events and public engagement, allowing organizations to take over the stages that are more programmed by people and giving that ownership over to the people who live in the community. In Providence, Rhode Island, some of the work also includes working with the police department and the community organizing organization. It's the one place where they come together to actually solve problems together instead of fighting about what the problems are, or the advocacy group actually becomes part of the solution rather than just the agitator, and the police actually become part of the solution rather than the problem. This is another picture of People's Paper Co-op. This is one of my favorites. It's just Faith again. We also believe that physical impact makes a big difference, and I think Chris did a lot of discussion around what that kind of work is. I love the pattern ideas and how discovering those patterns and then reimagining those things can change a place. So we really believe that when a place is well maintained and the buildings are kept up and there's investment in that public infrastructure externally, like what's happening here with the BEERLINE Trail. And forgive me if I sound really ineloquent. I've been up since 4 a.m. East Coast time, so this is a little bit difficult at the moment. It's so dark out there. Anyway, so really it's all about taking ownership of place and empowering the residents to have a place at the table in that design. A lot of that good work is actually happening along the BEERLINE Trail with the work that's happened there. We believe that murals are important, but unless there's some background to them, that there's some work in the back, on the back side of it where people are asked to vision what their community can be, or are participating in those projects, that it's just a first line in. There are many other ways to create those kinds of opportunities for folks in neighborhoods to learn from each other and create their own kind of cultural expression. Another way to talk about the built environment is obviously by just investing in place. This is a project in Covington, Kentucky. It's very similar to the Row House project in Houston that many of you probably have heard about, but Covington, Kentucky, the Center for Great Neighborhoods has a wonderful creative placemaking program that really includes the community. These were 3 row houses slated for demolition, and they renovated them, and it's now artist housing. 2 of the units are people who moved into the neighborhood, but one of the units is the longtime resident that was already there. One of them's also for a physically challenged person. And then economic impact. How do we take arts and culture and turn it into economic opportunity for the residents of our neighborhoods? How do we empower arts and youth organizations to develop programs that turn into workforce development programs? How do we incentivize some of the folks that may be selling their work at a night market and turn that business into an entrepreneurial business that it eventually may employ a few people in the neighborhood or grow even larger than that? So we're working. So right now we have a new CEO, Maurice Jones. His focus is really on economic opportunity for people and places, and that's a new place for us to really dive into. We've always supported small business development and things like that, but we're intentionally now supporting entrepreneurship and workforce development. So our creative placemaking program is really getting into that kind of work as well. This is Juxtaposition Arts in Minneapolis. It's a youth arts organization in North Minneapolis, really the epicenter of Black Lives Matter. And it is the only organization in that community, and it really has taken on the role of doing a lot of work in terms of community engagement and bringing neighbors in to reimagine this neighborhood. And this is the night market in Minneapolis, which actually it's in St. Paul. It's very similar to the night market that you were talking about here, but it's run by the Asian Economic Development Council, which is an entrepreneurship and business development organization that we've been working with to integrate creative placemaking into their work. And they've employed an artist organizer to help build that fabric up along this corridor. So our core values, and it's almost over, we're going to start to open this up to questions and have a conversation, really are about artists as leaders, as catalysts and change makers in neighborhoods, working with residents. Racial equity is a very important driver in our work. Development without displacement, how do we help our residents develop in place? Community-driven, collaborative, and comprehensive change. So these partnerships that Julia did such a great job talking about here in Milwaukee are the sort of are the way that we're working across the country. And then the most important thing really is to build the capacity and cultivate the agency of the people who live in the neighborhoods. We want residents driving this work. We want residents owning this work. And how do we set the table for that change to happen and benefit the people who live in our neighborhoods? So I'll end with that, and I'll end with this slide, and I guess we're going to open it up to questions. Okay, great.
Would anybody like to ask some questions? We're pretty close to winding it up, but come on up. And
Thanks. My name's Art Heitzer.
I'm sorry, could we have the house lights up a little bit? It's just really hard for us to see anybody out here. Thank you.
I'm president of the Milwaukee Turner, so I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank the presenters for these wonderful, stimulating presentations. I work in West Town. I live within 2 miles northwest of there in an area that we talk about being a food desert, etc. What I hear in this city is a critique, I guess, common critique, that the money is going to downtown big development, you know, this monster arena less than a block away from here, and not going into neighborhoods, and that they're being starved and the city is essentially dying because of that lack of resource. So I'm just wondering if any of you have any comments on that. I heard that resonating in the last speaker from Providence, but not quite as much from the people from Milwaukee. Any thoughts are welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that we focused on. We actually have an effort called Milwaukee United with the mayor and Urban League, Greater Milwaukee Foundation, and GMC. to look at that particular issue. Actually, it's broader. It's a 10-year action agenda for the downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods, because when you get into the neighborhoods, there's a very bright line of disparity between the development going on in the downtown and the neighborhoods. Part of it's getting into the reason why. Part of it is the fact that so many of the developments downtown are privately driven and have the TIF dollars to create that. And the city's budget is pretty upside down for development out in the neighborhood. So part of that is you're going to hear more discussion about how we actually change revenue structure at the city. But the other part of it too is we've been doing a lot of work with LISC on commercial corridor development in 8 neighborhoods around that downtown. And really trying to encourage local entrepreneurship to move into the neighboring commercial strips. And because that's a good way to create jobs. But we also know that creates general economic development. Right now on King Drive between the downtown and 5 Points out by Port Washington, there's over $100 million worth of development going on that street. Some of it's nonprofit driven, like the Bader Foundation going in, but some of it's very much Pete's Market, Garfield School, and some of the other work that's going on there. We'd like to encourage that type of development going on in the other areas. And in every one of those 8 corridors, there's at least one catalytic project. So we've spent a lot of time with the city and the private developers and LISC on focusing on that. Matter of fact, I was in a 3-hour meeting on that today. So this is a big issue because the downtown cannot prosper in the future if these neighborhoods don't prosper as well. So I think it's important that we build a mechanism, but there's also going to be a role that we're all going to have to play in the future as we look at additional funding for the city.
Thank you. That's really, I think, the question that's on everybody's mind, is that what's going on downtown is coming from private investment, but who's going to privately invest into our poor neighborhoods? Anybody else have a question?
In terms of what Chris was talking about, what you were talking about, the public realm, how do you think the community citizens can help push that kind of progress along? Because the private investors are developing the private realm, but who is it that pushes the investment in the public realm?
Yeah, Virginia, that's a great question. I'm convinced more and more that it simply has to come from a sort of groundswell of demand. And so in Milwaukee, for better or worse, when it comes to the public realm, we're sort of predisposed to replace it in kind when it comes time to fix something. And a lot of like what you saw here this evening, it can be done better with the same pot of money. And if you looked at like what's happening right now across the country in terms of like tactical urbanism, you look no further than New York City as a place that Jeanette Sedick-Kahn, who was their director of their DOT, came in and said, listen, we're a city that's pretty hostile to people, as it turns out. And what she did is started painting plazas, painting bike lanes, and they started testing things really quickly. And so I'm becoming more and more convinced that there's a two-pronged strategy that happens, and one is that when we reinvest and fix our assets, we have to ask our question, how are we making sure these assets are serving more than one thing? And that means how are they serving walking, but that same thing that we saw earlier. And at the same time, I think Milwaukee just can't try and catch up, because if you try and catch up, you spend all your energy catching up and you never actually do it. So somehow we have to find a way to leap forward. And what's been occurring to me lately is that if Milwaukee can be the city of yes, the city that's not either or, we can either do this or we can either do that, which has tended to be a mentality that I've seen over the years. We need to get experimental. We need to start testing things quickly, and we need it to come from the people, because for better or worse, we're going to do the same things if people aren't demanding it. And so we have to create a sort of political pressure that says we need it to be more than just serving cars.
I'm just going to add to that also, because I feel like the lighter, quicker, cheaper thing is really a great way to do that, to test those things, to demonstrate. When you demonstrate the possibility and then make sure that you capture the imagination of the leaders, it really does make a difference. We had a creative placemaking project where we got funding from the NEA to do a big festival on a transit corridor, transit plaza that was really very similar kind of urban redevelopment that wasn't working, and it was a solid use of just buses. I mean, we had 20,000 people going through this thing every day, and we did this big event, and it changed the way the mayor allocated the money for our redoing the roads downtown, and he moved money from another place to that to really fix that one spot. So that using that imagination, and then having residents and developers really pushing the agenda and partnering with the city and bringing in resources to reimagine, like so much of what Chris is talking about, really can actually move things quickly if those things come together.
My question is, being a black woman living in the inner city where I grew up at, used to be towers. We used to have, what was that, Marine Outboard on 27th Street. We had a lot of jobs, okay? Now, here it is, we don't have any jobs. And it's even as far as educational-wise, our children are still learning out of books. But if you go into the suburbs, their children have computers. So what do we propose to close this gap? If in the inner city, black children are still learning out of everyday books, but in the suburbs, they have computers. So how is we closing the economical gap and building jobs and creating to make our areas better, but we still 20 years behind? I live on 20th Street, but on 27th Street, the city of Milwaukee owns the old Towers Corporation. But what is they doing with that area? I mean, I've been off work 5 years, and I walk around and I look at my neighborhood, how it went down, and nobody's invested in it. We got a new corner store grocery, as I call it, but if it's supposed to employ black people, you go there, there's no really 2 or 3 black people, but the Iranians own it. Once again, now we're gonna look at them, suck all the money out of my neighborhood. The corner stores, basically owned by different ethnic groups. They take their money, it's not coming back in my neighborhood. So when is this gonna stop? I mean, who could propose something that's gonna help the black community? We're gonna quit acting like it's not affecting me. It's affecting the black people bad, and our children don't have opportunity to learn. If you're gonna study, give them a book, but out in the suburbs, your children have computers. There's no way to catch up.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw.
Well, I think we're firm believers that African American owned businesses tend to employ more African Americans, particularly when they're neighborhood based. So that's a big part of trying to encourage more business creation in those commercial corridors. I think the other beat on the schools is that I think we're really blessed to have Dr. Driver here with MPS, and she's done a lot to create transformation fairly quickly. I think in the public schools I work closely with Bradley Tech and with the 26 high schools, and most of the kids now have access to Chromebooks that are in the high schools. I don't know what it's like in the elementary, so I can't speak to that, but I think the other piece that's going on there is a big push on high school internships right now, because for so many kids, the trouble comes in the summertime when they're not in school and after school, and having a job. A lot of us think that that's a career path creator, but what it really does is it keeps kids out of trouble and gives them a new way to learn how to interact with people and how to work. And so we're trying to work very closely with Dr. Driver in identifying these schools like the culinary arts, the technical and trade. There's one now starting on IT and another one on financial services, advanced manufacturing, to really, and we're lining up the business community to ensure that we've got both summer as well as school time internships and in those programs. And I don't want to go on and on, but they're bringing back youth apprenticeship. But youth apprenticeship's not just in the trades, they're creating an IT youth apprenticeship, which means that starting in your junior year, you can get into that, you can get credits through the technical college, you can graduate with a year's worth of certificate, as well as have the apprenticeship a year into your apprenticeship going forward. So I think there's some really creative things going on. I think what we need to do is like support her as much as we can and continue to push into the business community about why these internships are important.
I'll just follow up on the jobs piece. One of the things that, again, Maurice Jones from LISC is doing is really trying to focus. We've done a lot of work on community safety. We've done a lot of work on our whole portfolio is really about housing and developing housing for folks. But he's really pushing up against this whole idea of economic development and job creation. And when I look and I talk to the national foundations, we start to see shifts in leadership, and we see African American men leading the Ford Foundation and Darren Walker. I think that there's going to be a shift. It may still be slow, but I think the national foundations are starting to really look at these issues in a fundamental way. It's not going to be HUD fixing that. It's not going to be the government fixing it. It's going to be the people who live in those neighborhoods being empowered to take control over and be given the resources in some way and cultivating those relationships to build those businesses that's going to make the change. It's not going to be somebody doing it for anyone. It's going to be people doing it together to rebuild. And I really feel like there's a groundswell of that happening right now, particularly with the shift in leadership in Washington, that those foundations are starting to take a much harder and longer look at how to get that done, because it's not working. We've been doing this for a long time and it's not working. So I think there's a shift there.
I just want to add to that, although my question is in a different realm, but today's Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, the series that's on the front page, they had a wonderful economic model from Cleveland using a co-op model where the Cleveland Clinic and University Hospitals and some other big institutions purchased basically like fresh vegetables were grown in black neighborhoods, and it was just a very neat model. I think this is the most critical issue facing Milwaukee right now. So I don't want to. But my question actually goes back to basically the public realm, and one of the things to me often in Chris's presentation, the public realm is often the street. It's the space between the buildings, and a lot of the models he showed were like that. And yet the street, no one owns it. The street is a very complicated entity, if you will. There are many, many public and private entities that control components of the street, from public works to traffic engineering to city forestry to private utilities, on and on and on. There will be maybe 15 players that control elements of street design and implementation. I'm just curious how, and I really address this to Chris, when you're trying to create the public realm out of a street, how do you bring these, even when you've got a design laid out, how do you bring the players together to implement it? Because they're often in their own silos.
Silos is the word. Well, I'll point back to that Bayview, then Altera, now Collectivo project. What happened there is we brought a business group to Bayview that said we want to invest. And what Collectivo does is they're concerned about a lot more than their bottom line. They're concerned about growing community and place. That's why they invested in River West to put their home base. And that's why they're kind of going out the way they are right now. But what we did is we formed a strategic partnership with the city, and it started at the top with Ghassan Korban, the director of Department of Public Works. He's a very progressive individual that understands where the city needs to go. And I said to Ghassan, I want to push the street out 27 feet into the right-of-way. There also happened to be a street reconstruct project that was happening alongside it. So part of it is just timing. These projects are planned years in advance, especially if it's a state project. It can be 5 years earlier. Decisions were already made on a project. But what we did is we got everybody in the same room. And what I found, I like to say I've kind of infiltrated DCD, Department of City Development, Department of Public Works over the last few years. And to be quite honest, what I've found, unsurprisingly, are really tight silos. to the point where the person planting trees, the person doing sewers, they don't even know each other exist. And what happens is it takes somebody in a lot of ways from the outside that can raise their hand. I would find myself in these meetings kind of wondering what the hell I'm doing here, because I'm an architect, I'm not an engineer. And I'd hear conversations going sideways, and I'd say, listen guys, what are we solving for once again? We did the same thing on 5th Street when we narrowed everything down, and we almost let a 100-year-old conduit change the whole plans until I said, are we going to let a 100-year conduit drive a 50-year reinvestment? And suddenly everybody got it immediately and started finding different ways to make things happen. So I think there's a long way of getting to we have to de-silo the silos right now. We need DPW and DCD talking to one another. And more importantly, we need a shared vision for what the city needs to become. And it's actually out there already, and it's called the Downtown Master Plan. There are other plans. Problem with these plans is they sit on shelves. Most people don't know they exist. Half the people working in departments aren't really aware they exist. So this is a struggle that is not unique to Milwaukee. It's almost every single city that you can come across, except for ones that have broke through and are enlightened about it. So again, it goes back to the idea that we as a community have to demand the place we want. The city we have is based on the choices we have made. And until we start asking for something else, we're going to get the same. So I think that's kind of what it comes down to.
I think we should end on this. If you want
I think,
something,
yeah, I was going to add to
Lynne?
that. I think one of the other things that's really important to understand about the way city government functions in these days of really stressed budgets and things like that is that if someone walks in, like Chris or any of you in this room, and comes in with a plan that's helpful, that allows a city employee to solve a problem in a new way, they're going to embrace it. I mean, they're going to be excited about it. They're going to want that. When we did all this work in Providence, it was really driven by the private business sector. We had one investor in the city, I call him the philanthropist investor who purchased a series of downtown buildings because he just, his family had been in the city for 300 years and he was the only one that hadn't fled to New York during the Depression and was still there sort of slogging away and wanting to make change. But he brought in Andres Dwani and introduced him to the mayor, and we did downtown charrettes that included people from all over the city, and it was a real kind of building momentum around changing the city as a group of people. It was a movement that we were doing together, and it lasted 25 years, and it's still going. But that initial kind of visioning session that we did in 1992, I think, still guides us today. And the planning department really adopted all those things and sort of made it a reality and changed zoning and looked at variances and changed, building heights and all kinds of things that Chris is talking about. The cool thing about Milwaukee is you're the size city where that could really happen, and it is happening already. And you've already got the seeds with these two great projects that are going on in the Greater Milwaukee Committee. So you have all that kind of matter. It's just a matter of organizing yourselves to kind of push it forward.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Lynn. I think that what we've heard tonight is that it takes us to ask and to make the change, whether it's at Cheryl's neighborhood level or whether it's at the city level. What Jane Jacobs was most worried about was the collusion between big government and big business. I think that's one of the reasons that she moved to Toronto, is that she saw what really big business could do if they displaced the poor, if they didn't take account for what they were doing, and they just did it for themselves rather than the common good. So I think that's how we can wind up tonight, is to talk about that we all go out and this is our work. We all need to do what we think is the best for Milwaukee. So. Thank you for coming.
An MCM production.